Everyone, juxtaposition here. Today's video is going to be a walk through memory lane of the 1960s into the 70s for the Beatles. Beatlemania, remember them? John, Paul, George, and Ringo, remember them? The Fab Four. The Fab Four. I was a big fan. I was a real big fan. Of course, they were presented on the Ed Sullivan Show. You know, the evil eye, the Masonic evil eye of Columbia Broadcasting System. Ed Sullivan, who wouldn't exist without the invisible hand. Clandestine service financed corporation with William S. Paley as chairman of the board and president, chief executive officer, formerly in charge of psychological warfare operations in London, England for the United States and Allied forces. In other words, to tell the friends and family of your service people what's going on, according to the invisible hand. Fake news, right? That's where Walter Cronkite eventually was recruited into, right? After they bounced Ed Murrow, kicked him to the curb. Remember Edward R. Murrow? Infield journalist. He was no Walter Cronkite, or I should say Walter Cronkite was no Edward R. Murrow. Anyway, Walter Cronkite, you remember, didn't finish university in Texas, University of Texas, Austin, and he went off to work for the UPI, United Press International, also known as Poppycock Propaganda. And then he was recruited into the OSS, United States Army, and then assigned to William Paley eventually after the war was over in New York City, where Walter Cronkite went on to host the CBS Evening News, which was a 30-minute fake news show out of New York. And then at the same time, they had, Chet Huntley and David Brinkley represent NBC. They had a tag team. They were partners. One was stationed in New York City, and the other knucklehead was in Washington, D.C., the central of government. And that was the NBC counterbalance to the CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System, Walter Cronkite Evening News. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you is the Beatles story is really no different than the Beach Boys or Doris Day, Bing Crosby, Elvis Presley. There's a lot of similarities to the story because guess what? All roads lead through CBS, the Masonic Eye, Columbia Records, Columbia Broadcasting System, and RCA, Radio Corporation of America, and the conglomerate evil twins in London, England. There's other names that you've heard of, Decca Records, EMI, you've heard of Warner Brothers, you've heard of Atlantic Records, Reprise, the Brothers. They're really not Tier 1. Tier 1 is RCA and CBS. That's who controls the radio frequencies. So it doesn't make any difference who a artist signs for, a television actor or a movie star, film star, or a recording artist. All roads eventually have to pay money and tribute to RCA and CBS. And typically they're partners in most of these deals to get the maximum coverage for your talent. So they're going to split it, RCA and CBS. It's the two heads of the Medusa. All right, so why would the Beatles be different? They're not. They're not different. So there's a lot of ways to tell the story. We don't have enough time. Obviously, there's quite a rich content when we're talking about Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo, and the Beatles, and all those songs. I think 378 published songs on albums pumped out in minimum time, like 6 years. From 1962 until 1969, January 1969. So really, it's 6 years. Because January 1969 is really, let's call it December 31st, 1968. So this is before Sharon Tate was murdered. So the last professional work that the Beatles did, they wrapped it up in January 1969. It was a wrap. And they didn't perform together again after January 1969. And they didn't really form a partnership regarding their recording contract until January 24th, 1962. So 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68 is 7 years. That's really how long the Beatles as a recording group performed, is in a 7-year period. In my mind, it's longer than that because they had to be formed, they had to rehearse, they had to practice, they burned through a few drummers before they got Pete Best. They got Pete Best, then he was terminated actually after they signed their contract. On January 24th, 1962, they signed a contract with Brian Epstein, a Jewish fellow from Liverpool. And that contract was put into jeopardy once they did their recording session with EMI with George Martin, which was done on June 6th, 1962. So it took about 5 months, took about 4.5 months to get EMI's attention and to get the boys to sit down to play Love Me Do for George Martin. Okay, and then after that was done, George Martin and others in the studio didn't feel that Pete Best was up to snuff and suggested that they use a studio drummer in lieu of Pete Best. So this put Brian Epstein in a pickle because he had already signed this contract, and he went to his attorney, and the attorney says, you can't fire Pete Best without paying him. I mean, you can fire him, but you're going to have to pay him anyway because he signed this contract. So this is a complicated situation, and we're going to circle back to this. They ended up finding another band for Pete Best, so Pete Best would just move to a different band. Then they terminated that contract, did a new contract with Pete Best, and then a new contract with the Beatles, who the Beatles wanted Ringo Starr to take over, and George Martin wasn't sold on Ringo Starr, and Brian Epstein didn't know if he would be good or not, and other names were thrown out, but John Lennon and Paul McCartney really liked Ringo Starr's personality, how he got along with the band. They liked how he played the drums, and but more importantly, he bonded with the group better than Pete Best, who would typically do his own thing after the music was played. He wouldn't socialize. He wouldn't sit around and shoot the breeze with the boys. So a decision was made to terminate Pete Best. That was effectively done in August. August 16th, 1962, Pete Best was out of the band and Ringo Starr was in. You see how quickly things go? Because it's, then we have the assassination of John Kennedy in Dallas on November 22nd, which is shortly after Pete Best goes bye-bye. John Kennedy goes bye-bye. And then just a couple months after that, the Beatles appear on Ed Sullivan's show for CBS out of New York. And there's Ringo Starr. But he's only been in the band for a couple months. And then they just rock it. The contract, just so you know, it paid 1 penny per record. A record requires 6 songs. So it's three songs per side. That'll pay a penny to the band. And the original contract, Brian Epstein got 10 to 15%. And then the boys would split the balance. But on the second time around, after Pete Best was replaced with Ringo Starr, and Paul McCartney his father didn't want Paul McCartney to sign a contract with a Jewish manager. I mean, I have to tell the truth, people. I've gotten a lot of feedback that I'm not hard enough on the Jews, that I'm not hard enough. I'm not anti-Semite. I'm not an anti-Semite. But I'm getting a lot of feedback that I'm not understanding that the Jews run the whole planet Earth or something. But here's the deal. As a percentage of the world population, the Jewish people are a small, small minority. But they dominate the entertainment industry in terms of management positions, agencies. In terms of banking, they also play a role, but there are Roman Catholics in there. And then people, oh, well, the Roman Catholics are Jewish and it's taken over by the Jewish. Okay, well, I don't know what to tell you. Get your own show and you can do broadcasts on how the Jews took over Catholicism. I do agree that the Holy See in Rome at the City of Vatican is a Swiss bank. Okay, so who runs that? Well, it looks like the Freemasons run it. They appear to be satanic and not Jewish. And then there's Roman Catholics who I guess drink the Kool-Aid and think they're Catholics, and they're working in banks. There's, Roberto Calfi was a Roman Catholic. He got whacked, hung by a rope, by the Blackfriar Bridge on June 17th, 1982. He's Catholic, and he got hung. And there are plenty. Look, don't make me do a list of all the Jewish people who've been whacked, similarly to Roberto Calfi, who was not Jewish. So I have Catholics getting assassinated, like Sharon Tate, for example. She was Roman Catholic. And Abigail Folger is Roman Catholic. She got whacked. And then I got Jerzy Kaczynski. He's a Polish Jew. He got suicide whacked. So, just knock it off on the anti-Semitism, feedback. All right, well, anyway, I'm just going to tell it how it is, and then, you guys can figure it out on your own. Do your own research. So let's just review that the Beatles began hitting the jackpot with Brian Epstein, who was a Jewish manager, a young man. And he managed them from 1962 up until his death, which was August 27th, 1967. So 5 years, and Brian Epstein managed the Beatles from age 27 until he was 32, when he died under mysterious circumstances, which sort of looks like a murder. Looks like he might have been murdered on August 27th, 1967, at his home in southern England, in Suffolk. You should know that that's about a 60-mile drive from the Blackfriars Bridge where Roberto Calfi was murdered. It appears that Brian Epstein may have been murdered in his bed or in his home, the south part of London in Suffolk. And what else can I tell you? So we're going to go back and look at the background of Brian Epstein, just so you know that I think he was groomed for service with social engineering, that he was put in charge of being a manager for 5 years to manage the Beatles. And then after he died, guess what? After some machinations and some concerns with Paul McCartney, again, getting married to Linda Eastman and her father, who's a New York attorney, and some competition to see who'd be the Beatles manager, after Brian Epstein mysteriously died. Alan Klein of Newark, New Jersey is selected. Another Jewish manager is selected to manage the Beatles. So we go from Brian Epstein to Alan Klein. But Alan Klein doesn't get the deal right away. He has to go through some machinations with Yoko Ono, make promises. Mick Jagger gets involved, because around this time you should also know that Brian Jones, Louis Brian Jones, the leader of the Rolling Stones, he despises Alan Klein, despises him, can't stand him, wants his $1,250,000 advance from Decca Records. He wants that money, which Alan Klein apparently stole. He put a record advance for the Rolling Stones in 1965, a payment of $1,250,000, which is a lot of money. It's like, $30 million today. And he put that in his personal bank account. Yes, he did. So Brian Jones was very unhappy with Alan Klein and had been for a number of years. So you should know that Brian Jones went bye-bye in his swimming pool on July 3rd, 1969. Now that's pretty interesting timing because, he's telling Paul McCartney, don't sign a deal with that guy. He's a criminal. He's a snake. And he's another Jewish manager, right? Yeah, but it was too late because Alan Klein signed his deal with the Beatles on May 8th, 1969. And Brian Jones was murdered less than 2 months after that happened. So Brian Jones was not effective in persuading John Lennon or George Harrison and Yoko Ono, most importantly Yoko Ono, who I believe is a control agent. I think Yoko Ono is the clandestine services control agent for John Lennon. That's what I think. I know she's still around. She's, getting on in age now. But I think she completely and utterly controlled John Lennon, including up to his death, who looks like it wasn't Mark Chapman. It looks like it was their doorman at the Dakota. The Dakota, Rosemary's Baby, Mia Farrow, Roman Polanski, John Cassavetes, the Dakota, where the devil impregnates a young 21-year-old woman who's married to a 44-year-old Frank Sinatra at the time. You can't believe this stuff. Anyway, the background for Alan Klein is not that dissimilar than the childhood background for Brian Epstein. It's remarkably similar. They both had troublesome childhoods, and they had attention deficit disorder. I think both of them did. And if I get into it, we'll just burn up the time, and I'm going to skip over that. We can come back and revisit their background later. There's some other more important things I want to bring up, but Brian Epstein's background with Jewish parents and immigrants, his grandparents were immigrants to England, and his parents ended up in Liverpool, although they did move away during World War II, and then they moved back to Liverpool, and they were in the retail store business, and they had several stores, Brian Epstein was drafted, conscripted into the Royal Army, and paradoxically, at age 18, after he'd been expelled from numerous boarding schools, and he was then sort of considered a goof-off, right? Lazy, didn't do his homework, big dreams, and he goes into the Royal Army, but they station him. This is really an indication that Brian Epstein was selected. I think they knew he was a homosexual, and he wanted a career in the theater. He wrote his father a long letter that he wanted to be a dress designer for women at age 16, which Brian Epstein's father forbid him to be a dressmaker. And so he went into the Army, and then he's in the Royal Army, and they assign him to Regent's Park Armory. As a really upscale part of central London. It's not that far away from where Cass Elliot was done away with. It's not far from where Keith Moon was murdered in the exact same room that Cass Elliot was murdered in. It's in close proximity. It's 3 miles from the Playboy Club, which is the Church of Scientology's in that building, aka the Church of Compulsion Analysis Division, which gets renamed the Process Church when it crosses over the Atlantic Ocean and lands in the United States. They change it to Process Church. By the time it gets to San Francisco, it's the Process Church. But it was in London, England in the 60s, next to the Playboy Club, in the same building as the Playboy Club, where they had the fake Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate cocktail party, to celebrate their wedding that never happened, their fake wedding. It's probably a 2-hour cocktail party, attended really by professional actors and surveillance spooks from MI5. The man from U.N.C.L.E. All right, so what I wanted to tell you is that when Brian Epstein is sent to the army and they send him to basically, Piccadilly Circus, he's very close proximity to Piccadilly Circus, which is the entertainment theater district, and it's upscale shopping, and he's like a mile and a half away from there. And then he pays to get a officer uniform, and he goes to a gay bar near Piccadilly Circus where military policemen immediately ask him for identification, and he's not an officer. He's only been in the army for 10 months. So he's arrested for impersonating an officer. Then at the court-martial, Brian Epstein has to make a deal where if he agrees to see psychiatrists, they will not imprison him, for impersonating an officer. So he does that. Now, if you watch my videos, people, there's a big theme, when you talk about all these people, Timothy Leary, Louis Jolyon West, Sidney Gottlieb, Frank Olson, Albert Laverne from Manhattan and then Yonkers and the Bronx, Albert Laverne, Fordham University and Bellevue State Hospital, with psychiatrists seeing military people who have behavioral problems, like Leonard Lake, like Charles Ng, who went AWOL in the Marines, like Leonard Lake, who was discharged on a medical basis, like the son of Sam, alleged killer, David Berkowitz. Again, psychiatrists involved with him. The My Lai Massacre, psychiatrist involved with William Calley. McMartin School case, multiple psychiatrists involved. The Jose and Kitty Menendez murders, alleging that Lyle and Eric, the boys, age 18 and 21, did it. Crazy wackadoodle psychologists involved in that case. Kitty was seeing a psychologist, the mother. She was seeing a psychologist. Abigail Folger, who gets bayoneted 28 times on the lawn at Silver Drive, she's seeing a psychologist. Psychologists are a part of the command and control system. And it's also explains how when I first went to the Bohemian Club, I was mystified how I could have a conversation with George Shultz, who at that time was the Secretary of State, which is really the number one CIA officer in the United States, number one Secretary of State. The department head, DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, that's kind of like the second position, or it's at least parallel. And at the time that I met George Shultz and had a conversation with him, Caspar Weinberger was in the room. He wasn't standing with us. He was a couple of people away. He was in close proximity. And William Casey had been the director of CIA. And then remember, we had the Iran-Contra scandal, and William Casey mysteriously died of a brain tumor, cancerous brain tumor, if you believe that. And then he was replaced with a guy named William Webster. It's kind of confusing because there's a lot of Williams. Remember, there's William Colby, who took over after Richard Helms and kind of sort of helped clean up the Watergate, made Watergate go away, by telling the media just stop reporting on it. That's how you make stories go away. You just stop talking about it, right? And it's like COVID. Just stop talking. If you don't talk about COVID, then it won't exist. Not in real life. It can only exist on television and in media. That's it. So if you just stop talking about it, then it just goes away, vanishes. Poof. So we had that situation going on in 1987 when William Casey passed away, and he was quickly replaced by William Webster, who's a longtime Bohemian, guest member. Undoubtedly, he's a member. He certainly goes a lot. He probably was there the night that I was there, but I did not get introduced to him, and he wasn't necessarily a well-known, public figure. He had been the director of FBI, and I was not paying attention to who's, doing that stupid job. and he picked up after, remember, J. Edgar Hoover passed away, and then his gay lover, Clyde Tolston, was the director, I think, for one day. I don't know if you know that, but J. Edgar Hoover's gay lover, who was already on the payroll, he became the director of the FBI after J. Edgar Hoover died. And then they had a couple of other temporary directors before William Webster was selected, and he did that for a few years. And then anyway, so he became the replacement for William Casey, who was involved with the Iran-Contra, Oliver North and George W. Bush, and processing cocaine and God knows where their drugs in Honduras and in Central America, and then trading it for weapons and money laundering. And believe me, there's a lot more to that story than you've heard. But I have to bring it up because these people, they all know each other. And I was confused why Phil Heiress, who I also met and spoke with, who was partners with Jack Benny for, again, RKO, RCA Radio in New York. And why would he be at a party with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, who, by the way, they were both executive vice presidents at Bechtel Corporation. And in the case of George Shultz, he became the president and chairman of the board, or a director of the Bechtel Family Construction Company. So he wasn't a low executive. He was the CEO and director of the board. And then he goes on to become Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, head of the CIA offices throughout the whole world. That's where the CIA has offices, at the State Department, embassies throughout the world. All right, so the situation is that Brian Epstein was in a bind because he's having to, as part of his probation, has to see these psychologists, and they recommend sending him, discharging him on a medical basis out of the Army, send him back to Liverpool, where he can work with a psychologist in close proximity to his parents. And they do that, and he's only 19 years old. Okay, so he's very young. And the psychologist immediately decides, no, we should send him back to London because he wants to be an actor. So we're going to send him to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, the Royal Academy. So what I'm telling you is the clandestine services has selected Brian Epstein because he's homosexual, because he's on probation, because he'll obey, and he shows a flair for theater. And rather than have him work for his parents selling furniture in Liverpool, why not train the boy to be a spook, to be a clandestine soldier? Like they did with Roman Polanski, like they did with Jerzy Kaczynski, like they did with Wojtek Wojciechowski, like they were doing with Sharon Tate, like they were doing with Abigail Folger. Right? They were doing that with Brian Epstein. Now, he had not, the Beatles didn't exist yet. I mean, they're just out there bouncing around Liverpool trying to find their way, but they're not in a group yet. But while this is going on, while the Beatles are trying to figure out what they want to do for a living, Brian Epstein is seeing psychologists who are sending him back and getting him accepted into the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, which has an acronym like all CIA institutions, RADA. And if you're wondering what students were attending RADA, Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, in 1956, if you're wondering, I'll tell you. Susan York, Albert Finney, who goes on to star in Network, which is like a play on CBS Masonic Eye. Network. Peter O'Toole, right? Peter O'Toole. What was this? Lawrence of Arabia, Peter O'Toole. All right, so there's Brian Epstein. He could have been another Albert Finney, right? He could have been Peter O'Toole. But instead, no, after he drops out, he doesn't finish the program, and he goes back to Liverpool, and his parents open a new store for him to manage. And then, quite bizarrely, immediately, Peter Brown, an American who works across the street from the new store that Brian Epstein's parents opened, they befriend each other and kind of partner up. So I'm saying that that's a control agent in field, Peter Brown, probably from the CIA, and he starts becoming the assistant for Brian Epstein, and they start looking around for a social engineering group to find. And they find the Cavern Club, which you should know that Brian Epstein actually paid for a band to perform at his 21st birthday at the Cavern Club. So it's not as if the Cavern Club was not known to him. It was known to him long before it was known to John Lennon. It was known to Brian Epstein. So the Cavern Club is a place that's it's a magnet. There's other clubs. That's not the only club. And by the time that John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison get together, they do have a manager named Alan Williams, and he books them at other clubs, not the Cavern Club. And then he gets them a gig in Germany at Hamburg, which is near the ocean. And Alan Williams gets 10% of whatever the Beatles get paid. And back then they were using another drummer, and then they used Pete Best. So basically the Beatles are learning how to play their instruments in Hamburg. And then when they come back, they get booked into the Cavern Club, which I'm telling you is a selection location for clandestine services, Peter Brown and Brian Epstein. There's not a lot of information on this Peter Brown. He's a very mysterious person, but I'm here to tell you that Brian Epstein didn't work alone. That's the illusion that he's a sole, Lee Oswald acting alone. No way. No way. Remember, even in William Colby always said, Gladio is teams of three. Teams of three. All right, so you should just know that Brian Epstein approaches the Beatles and wants to change their wardrobe and wants to put them on wear business suits and no more curse words, stop the cigarette smoking, don't eat food on stage, bow, run through your set in a tight fashion, and so a lot of basic stuff, right, to get them more presentable for a corporate sponsorship, which is coming. And once they sign a contract with Brian Epstein, which they do, like I said, that was done in June. No, it was done on January 24th, 1962. The Beatles are formed. Their name is changed to the Beatles, and they sign a deal with Brian Epstein, with this mysterious Peter Brown sort of in the background. And Peter Brown and Brian Epstein, appear at the weddings for Paul McCartney and John Lennon, who remember married Cynthia around this time. Cynthia, John Lennon's first wife, Cynthia. And also was I believe this Peter Brown is the godfather to Julian Lennon, the John Lennon's son, first son. So he's not an irrelevant person. It's funny that he's just a mystery man. All right, so everything's going well. There's all these songs that are produced, which I'm thinking that there's professional help with John Lennon and Paul McCartney. I don't believe that they could write, 600 songs and select 378 of them for however many albums they pumped out in 7 years. That's a lot of production. And with all the traveling and all the concerts and all the publicity requirements, it's exhausting. It's exhausting, the schedule that they were on for the 7 years that they were that they were working. And 5 of them with Brian Epstein. Those 5 years with Brian Epstein were exhausting. So I'm telling you that I think that there were adult people, professional songwriters, like the Wrecking Crew is to Laurel Canyon artists and the Monkees, that there are these invisible people, invisible writers that can pump out the lyrics and the melodies, and then the Beatles can just rehearse and play them, and that'll really speed up the process. Because I believe it's impossible to produce that much content. Two young guys in their early 20s. I don't believe it. Absolutely. I never did. I really never did believe it. I was always astounded how many hit songs. Plus, getting their tunes played on the radio with the pace that they did, I mean, that's how you make a hit, is you give it airtime. And there's a lot of songs that are really nice, and they get no airtime at all. So part of the magic is that, because there's a lot of Beatles songs that are really lousy, that are really not very good, and they got a lot of airtime. And I sort of would listen to them just because I like the Beatles. But today, I look back, that's a really pathetic song. And John Lennon didn't like lots of the songs that he alleged participated in. He didn't like a lot of the songs that are on Beatles albums either. Well, I share the same philosophy as John Lennon. See, John Lennon liked to speak the truth a lot, and that's perhaps why he's not alive. Where Paul McCartney was a lot more, friendly and better salesperson, better corporate image, which would explain why Paul McCartney had a longest career of anyone. Anyway, so we get out to 1967, and of course there's a cover story which I don't believe. George Harrison marries Pattie Boyd. She's only 23 years old. He's 24 years old. And they want to get spirituality in their life. I say poppycock on that. A 23-year-old model photographer is not that interested in spirituality. I mean, they're busy living the dream of traveling and staying in hotels. And she's married to a Beatle, George Harrison. So I don't think they're looking for spirituality. But that's the cover story. And then Patty looks in the newspaper in London and she sees the spiritual regeneration movement, which is transcendental meditation. And she hears about the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And he's coming to town. He's coming to London town. Now that's clandestine services, people. The Maharishi Yogi, he's sponsored by the same people that created Church of Scientology, over by the Playboy Club. Only he's transcendental meditation. So we had LSD, we had meditation, transcendental meditation, then we have the spiritual regeneration movement. So that comes to town in 1967, in February 1967, right? And so allegedly Pattie Boyd signs up to be a member of spiritual regeneration movement. And then she drags George Harrison, who drags, John Lennon, and eventually Paul McCartney goes, and they all listen to the Maharishi talk about transcendental meditation. And then they book a conference in North Wales, up there in Bangor, Wales, and they go off to a retreat, still in London. And whilst they're at that retreat, Brian Epstein's father passes away. And then Brian Epstein goes to a Shiva to mourn for 7 days after the burial of his father. And then he retreats back to his home in Sussex. And then he promises to join John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison and Ringo at the retreat in Bangor, Wales, and meet the Maharishi. But he doesn't, because he mysteriously dies in his bed. And I'm not going to get into the drugs that were involved with that, but that looks like a murder. So it looks like Brian Epstein was planning to join the Beatles, and it didn't happen because he died. And it's about a 350-mile distance from where Brian Epstein's home is in Sussex, which is actually close to where... trying to think who else lives there. Oh, the Rolling Stones, who died, Paul Jones, he lives about 10 miles from where Brian Epstein lives. He lives about 10 miles to the west is where Louis Paul Jones, the leader of the Rolling Stones, who dies, in 1969. But so he dies in a swimming pool, and Brian Epstein dies in his bed. All right. So this is throws a spanner wrench into the Beatles because their trusted manager has now died, and then they make plans to go visit the Maharishi in India, which is a 12-hour plane flight away. And in case you're wondering where Ashram Rishikesh is located, that's the compound, the spiritual compound for Transcendental Meditation, aka Clandestine Services British Intelligence Compound. It's not that far from where Francis Gary Powers took off to do his overflight over Russia in Peshawar, Pakistan. Of course, which is near Kabul, Afghanistan. You've heard of that, right? Where the heroin is, Kabul. Well, okay, it's not walking distance to Kabul or Peshawar, but it's still a hike, but it's a lot closer than London is, right? So it may be in the same time zone. It may actually be an hour off, but anyway, so the Rajneeshna is out there, and you should know this is in February 1968. Off goes George Harrison and John Lennon, and then Paul McCartney catches up later with Ringo. And they're not alone there, because at this retreat is none other than Mike Love, the eldest member, the cousin of Dennis Wilson and Brian Wilson. Mike Love, who pretends that he doesn't know who Charlie Manson is, yet he let his children be babysat by him, at the Will Rogers estate in Pacific Palos Verdes. Mike Love, he goes to the Rajneeshna retreat with Mia Farrow, with Donovan. You've heard of him, remember? Donovan. And there they are. And they eat, it's a vegetarian style diet. There's dogs, stray dogs that run around, even a stray lion. According to Mike Love, a stray lion came into the camp. And basically you sleep, you meditate, you eat, and you can play music. That's it. And then there's some kind of a sex scandal that happens with the Maharishi, who has sex with an underage child. What a surprise. Kind of fits into the whole, Jeffrey Epstein theme, right? So the Beatles have to cut it short. It was supposed to be a 90-day retreat, which they produced 48 songs, which then appear on the White Album. Many of the 48 songs appear on the White Album. Okay, I'm calling poppycock on that. I don't think you can go to India to a transcendental meditation camp and produce 48 songs in like 45 days or less. When you have a trip that's cut short with all the travel, and John Lennon doesn't have his wife with him, and the other people do. There's a spouse-guest situation, but John Lennon didn't take Cynthia with him. She was left behind with Julian. So it's kind of an awkward situation, and when I see Mike Love and I see Mia Farrow and I see Donovan and the Beatles are all at this place, and the Beatles are the only ones that pump out all this music, I'm saying that that's a controlled, that's like the Esalen Institute. If you don't know what the Esalen or the Eucalyptus Institute is, that's what it's called. No, it's not the Eucalyptus Institute. It's the Himalayan Institute of Big Sur. Get it straight, people. Esalen Institute is 11 miles south of Big Sur. When people talk about, I see in Wikipedia all the time, they talk about the Esalen Institute where Neil Young played after Woodstock, and all these Hollywood stars are run through there with LSD therapy, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone says, oh, it's Big Sur. No, it's not. It's 11 miles south of Big Sur. There's nobody in Esalen. There's no tourists down there. There's lots of campers and tourists in Big Sur. That's why they moved it. The Himalaya Institute was at Big Sur. And as the tourism grew after World War II, because that Himalayan society of sex, magic, and drugs was created in Big Sur, after the tourism kicked up, they decided to relocate it down the road, down Highway 1, Pacific Coast Highway, to where the driveway that leads up to Army Base Fort Hunter Liggett, that's where the Essel Institute, it's near Fort Hunter Liggett Army Base. Now, it's not easy access, but it's in close proximity to an army base. And the Hearst Castle. Remember Patricia Hearst's family? The Hearst Empire? It's not too far from the Hearst Castle. It's where the Essel Institute is. That's kind of sort of what the Maharishi's retreat is like. It's like an Essel Institute in India for British intelligence. That's what I'm calling that. That's my supposition, and that's my opinion, and, I'm sticking with it. So, where do I go next? So, the Beatles come back home. They don't have a manager. They're very confused. And somebody, of course, introduces a New Jersey Jewish fellow, Alan Klein, who nobody likes because he's a criminal. He steals money from his clients, from Sam Cooke to the Rolling Stones to Edie Gourmet and Lawrence. Isn't it Lawrence and Edie Gourmet? He does not get along with his clients, and he comes from an accounting background. He did not get a CPA. I'm happy to tell you that Alan Klein did not get a license in New Jersey as a certified public accountant. Now, there were a number of people who wrote letters to the state of New Jersey recommending that Alan Klein never be licensed as a CPA because he's such a dishonest person. That's who the Beatles select. Now, when I say the Beatles, I mean Yoko Ono selected, because he went through Yoko Ono. He promised Yoko Ono her own art studio, gallery in Greenwich, Connecticut, in New York City, in the hoity-toity part of Manhattan, Greenwich Village. He promised Yoko, he told her what she wanted to hear, and to give $1 million cash advance to John Lennon, who was broke. And so really that's how he seduced John Lennon, was that it was Yoko's idea, and she controlled John, and Paul McCartney wanted no part of another Jewish manager, so he fought it. He inserted his girlfriend Linda's father. That didn't go over well. They eventually reached a compromise where Alan Klein would be a provisional, temporary on probation manager, and that Linda Easton's father would be the lawyers. And that lasted, I think, 3 weeks, because, remember, Alan Klein likes to put money in his personal accounts, and I'm sure Linda Easton's father likes to audit the books. So there was no way Alan Klein was going to be able to handle the money without being detected. So he gave an ultimatum to the guys, and Paul McCartney got outvoted because Ringo and George Harrison and Paul McCartney all agreed to fire Linda Eastman's father and to sign a 3-year contract with Alan Klein. But you should know they didn't do that until May 1969. Okay? Now, the reason that that's important is, remember, the Beatles last worked together in the studio for Abbey Road in January 1969. And then they performed on the roof of the Abbey Road studios in downtown London in January 1969. And they never performed together again, ever. But they signed this contract with Alan Klein on May 8th, 1969, which is 4 months after they last performed. And so he collected money from the Beatles and stole money from the Beatles from May 8th, 1969 until 1972, when the contract expired and Paul McCartney launched a mega lawsuit against him, which took a long time to settle. And then it went past John Lennon's assassination. And then Paul McCartney delivered a huge check to Yoko Ono, much to his chagrin, I'm sure. Because in the end, Alan Klein had to refund a lot of the money that he stole from the Beatles. Don't know how the Rolling Stones made out, but Paul McCartney, you got to give the guy credit for hounding Alan Klein. And Alan Klein died at age 77. And so that's that. Now, what I can also tell you is that that retreat out there where the Maharishi was running this Institute for Transcendental Meditation, I was wondering, Who funded that, right? Does the British intelligence write a check? No. Doris Duke wrote a check. Doris Duke, who's the heiress of the tobacco empire from Wallace Duke, her grandfather. Yeah, she wrote a $100,000 check to underwrite the Maharishi back in the early 1960s. So that's like at least, $10 million minimum today. And where did she live? I was just wondering where Doris Duke, who brought you all those lovely cigarette products that you probably are familiar with. So let's just review very quickly here. I'll tell you. Anyway, all right, I'll come back to it later. So the thing is that Doris Duke was living at 1436 Bella Drive. That's right. I said Bella Drive. That's the address. That's the street that Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger were murdered on. Bella Drive. I realized the media tells you it was 10050 Sailor Drive. It was Bella Drive. It's Bella Drive. It's the road that Rudolph Valentino built a home at 1436 Bella Drive. And in 1955, approximately, Doris Duke moved in there, and she remained in that home until she died at age, I think she was 81, and in 1993, which was before the Sharon Tate murder house and the Doppelganger twin, because it's two properties that are mirror images of each other. They were finished in 1944. They were built by RKO Studios. Doris Duke moved in 1955 when 4 additional homes that complement the Sharon Tate murder site, they were being constructed at the same time that Doris Duke moved into 1436 Bella Drive, which, by the way, looks directly onto the Sharon Tate murder scene property. Just like Art Linklater's home on Bel Air Road looking east from west, Doris Duke's home is east looking west onto the Sharon Tate murder property. You see? So that's more than just a little coincidence there, people. The Bella Drive address, meaning the crime scene, and all the homes in close proximity to where, scandalous parties were held, Hollywood parties were held. It's a surveillance home. That's where the murder was done. That hasn't changed. That's the same situation today in 2022. We have the same. They've torn down the homes. They've rebuilt them. It's the same geography, though. Everything that I'm telling you about existed in 1944 exists today in 2022. Doris Duke. So what I'm saying is that she's a bank money laundering apparatus, just like Joe Kennedy was with RKO Pictures, because Joe Kennedy Sr. was associated with RKO construction of the murder scene property where Sharon Tate was murdered. That was John Kennedy's father was involved with the construction of that project. All right? Not personally, but indirectly. And Rudy Valentino is living, with the surveillance home looking in on that property. And then Art Linklater's got a surveillance home. And quite frankly, all the homes below Art Linklater are also excellent surveillance homes, just like the Rudolph Valentino home was. Anyway, it's a hell of a coincidence that Doris Duke was, I'm not sure that she was there the evening of August 9th, 1969, but the point is that she lived, you want to know the distance? 0.4 of a mile, walking distance. As the crow flies in a straight line, it's 1/10 of a mile. Okay, and what is 1/10 of a mile? That's like 600 feet. It's about 600 feet away. If you have binoculars and a telescope, it's a 600 feet view to where Abigail Folger and Wojtek Rakowski were bayoneted on the lawn. 600 feet away from the Doris Duke house. So Doris Duke is controlled, and so was the Beatles, and so was Brian Epstein, and apparently so was Alan Klein, who ended up sort of kind of like, the other Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein, right? And who's the other Jewish fellow that's in trouble? Harvey Weinstein, right? So he's in prison, having to wear a face diaper in a satanic court, listening to the Me Too movement about him being a pervert. That's like nothing new. It's always been that way. There must be 1,000 Harvey Weinsteins. There must be 1,000 Jeffrey Epsteins. Must be 10,000 Ghislaine Maxwells, right? All right, that's enough for today. I just wanted to, I never in a million years thought that the Maharishi would be tied to Doris Duke, which would be tied to be a surveillance house for the Sharon Tate murder. I never saw that coming. I never saw that the Beatles had a Jewish manager, Brian Epstein, who they replaced with another Jewish manager from Newark, New Jersey, named Alan Klein. I never saw that they would be embroiled in litigation with Alan Klein for many years, and I never thought that they were so controlled. But now I know they are, just like Frank Sinatra was, just like Dean Martin was, just like Sharon Tate was, just like Abigail Folger was, just like Lena LaBianca was. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Take care.